It's mainly still the most accessible movies left, or the ones you can put on a big screen. There are no more film copies. Well, it's really difficult. And then, yes, there are a lot of heads cut off, but you have to know that that's something the Dutch occupants did in Indonesia, because you have to know that Indonesia has a very strong history. They have been occupied for 100 years by Portugal in the 16th century, and then 400 years by Dutch people, and then the Japanese for 4 years. Then they were free, had a national war, 1 million more dead people, and then the dictatorship started until 1998. So it's not very fun to be Indonesian, obviously. And the Dutch, what they did when they conquered the country, they cut off the head, because it was the worst thing they could do to the Muslim people, which have to be buried as a whole. And especially the head is something very, very characteristic, very strong. It's related, that's where the spirit is. So to cut off a head, to kill somebody, it's the worst you can do. And that's something they put in action movies also to remind. It means that's the worst death you can give to an opponent, and that's remind. So all the Indonesians, when they see a head getting cut off, it reminds them the ancient times under Dutch occupation.
You seem very, you know a lot about the Indonesian cultures and cinemas and the backgrounds. What was your first encounter to this region?
Indonesia is a country I came to get known very late. Actually, I'm a specialist within Asian movies, generally speaking. And I started off with Japanese and then a lot of Hong Kong movies. I did really silly things to watch. Well, I won't tell them here. And Indonesia, actually, in 2007, I was in a Cannes film market, not the film festival, the film market, and I went into a wrong theater. And when I noticed, I was about to leave, and then there was this lady coming up with 3 actresses in introducing her own movie, which you never do on the market. On the market, you do business. You buy movies, you don't want to have an introduction. So I stayed because of that, and she was really funny. And I discovered this Indonesian movie. I thought it was great. It was a movie about polygamy, made by a female director. And I thought, wow, can you do something like that in the biggest Muslim country of the world? And what's going on in Indonesia? And I found out that they were doing 80 movies a year I wasn't aware of. And that's how
the team.
80, in the whole, 80 movies. Hong Kong, Korea does 120 movies, France does 220 movies, so 80 movies, it's quite a lot. It's the 14th biggest movie producer in the world. And that's how I dug into the cinema, and then I was getting into the history, and I'm always trying to understand the movies while also studying the history and how this all can happen. Even a romantic comedy has always something very local specific, so I want to know why they don't kiss on the screen, even if it's still a romantic comedy. So I have to know, okay, it's Muslim and blah blah blah. Yes, that's how I...
Was the information easy to find? Because in Hong Kong it's quite hard, like we don't get used to watch much. I don't think there's often opportunities for us to watch any Indonesian film unless the raid and stuff, or in the film festival circus we watch some art house selections, but they're not the commercial ones or the popular ones. Was it easy to find for you in France?
About Hong Kong, really, you're very lucky. A lot of people have studied Hong Kong movies abroad, and you had a lot of successes abroad, like Bruce Lee's in the 70s, and then the Wong Kar-wai in the more artistic way. So you can find a lot of things. You are very lucky to have a film archive, which is beautiful, with a lot of 35mm prints, a lot of books. All this you don't have in Indonesia. In Indonesia, you can learn about the country, you have history books, a lot of history books are not accurate because of this dictatorship or the occupation, so many things are wrong. But about cinema, you have nothing. So it's really hard, that was the biggest challenge for my documentary, to find out. And there is a film archive, but when I asked about pictures of movies, they opened a room and there were 8,000 pictures lying on the ground. So that was one of the first things. With my team, we started doing what they should have done for decades, sorting it all out. And the other thing is, since cinema, like in almost every Asian country, is not considered art or culture, but pure entertainment, there have not been many writings, especially in Indonesia. There are not many film critics from the older times, and not many film historians. And the only film historian you have, you can see him very briefly at the quite beginning. It was one of the other men who says that this director did movies not to make money, but for an artistic. It was also an artistic tool. I put in only a few seconds because he spoke very slowly. So for 2 sentences or ideas, I would have needed 2 hours of movie, so I couldn't do that. And for him, as the only film historian, Indonesian cinema only starts from the 1950s, because all movies made before were made with Dutch money or Chinese money. So for him, that's not cinema and not national Indonesian cinema. So he didn't want to talk me anything about what happened before 1950. And that's why I had to make up the character of this strange white-haired guy popping up the spirit for me, because nobody could tell me many things about Indonesian cinema, so I had to write and do this fictional part, so people would know, as Indonesians would know and learn about their own cinema. And that's why the fiction within the documentary.
So basically, you included the film The Long March, yes, which is produced in 1950. That was the first Indonesian film.
Yes, that's considered the first Indonesian movie by all the film historians, because it has been made only with Indonesian money, with an Indonesian team, Indonesian casting. And the day of the first shooting day is considered the day of cinema and still celebrated up until today.
Does anyone have any questions?
And just to finish, actually it's quite ironical, because The Long March tells a story about soldiers walking for a long time. That's why The Long March, they didn't invent very much, didn't church. But that, of course, reverts to The Long March in China of Mao. So it's quite interesting to see that they reject everything the Chinese did beforehand, but the very first Indonesian movie actually retells the story of Mao. But yeah, I think it's fun.
Thank you very much. Really, I've watched a lot of movies, but for Indonesian movie, I've seen the first one that I came across was the Raid. Okay, and then I've seen it on the movie, and it really gave me a very, very an impression, you know, a shock. Oh, Indonesian movie can be so good. A lot of actions and horrors for me, and so I think it's, for me, I really don't know much about Indonesia, this country, but nowadays we have seen a lot of Indonesians here in Hong Kong helping us, a lot of families. So I think these movies are very, I think you can, I mean, a lot of Indonesians here in Hong Kong can see it. And I think I really enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your nice words. Yes, you have a lot of Indonesian maids, actually. That was something, yeah, it opened up in the 80s, still under dictatorship, and there have been a contract signed between Hong Kong and Indonesia to import, I don't know, export maids to help you out. Suharto, the old dictator, really saw something to relaunch some economics and to release some pressure at that time. And from one day to the others, there were like 19,000 Indonesian women leaving the country to go not only to Hong Kong, but also to England and some other countries. It was a very difficult time. They opened up schools to teach those Indonesian women to use some tools they never seen before, like laundry machine or something, because Indonesia was still quite poor outside of Jakarta and some bigger towns. And it was really difficult for many of those women to get abroad and leave their families. And yes, it's really interesting also to study about that, because it had a huge impact on Indonesian families and something broke at that time. So that's another huge topic.